welcome and thank you for joining us for a discussion on this very important topic. My name is Kim Talus. I'm the director of Tulane Center for Energy Law. The center was created in 2018 for a place for research, teaching in energy law and international energy law, as well as to function as a neutral place to discuss pressing energy issues that we face today. Unlike most other centers, we focus on value chains. Energy value chains, their regulation, the interlinkages between different parts of the value chain, all the way from production of energy to the end use of energy. Today's topic provides an opportunity to discuss various policy failures throughout these energy value chains in the south parts of the US and Texas in particular. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Sirja-Leena Penttinen, who acts as the Assistant Director of the Energy Law Center. Her research focuses on integration of sustainable energy into our energy markets, as well as end use of energy. Sirja-Leena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning and welcome also on my behalf. Today, the topic of our webinar is the power system failure that took place around Valentine's Day, February this year in the southern part of the United States. Our discussion focuses, as Kim mentioned, in particular on Texas, which faced the most severe conditions. Texas energy system has been especially built for the summer heat, whereas this event is described to be an unprecedented winter storm with extreme temperatures that extended over a long period of time. Almost half of electric reliability, Council of Texas generation capacity, was forced out at the highest point during the winter storm due to the impacts of various extreme weather conditions, which prompted rotating outages as electric demand had to be limited to available generation supply. Control outages were implemented to prevent statewide blackout, thus to safeguard the grid. Finger pointing is going everywhere as pressure mounts for accountability following the widespread failure of Texas electric grid. While detailed analysis of the Texas energy crisis is still ongoing, I believe there are some initial lessons that can be learned and root causes to be analyzed. I hope this will be a productive webinar to share lessons and identify potential solutions here in the US, but also given our international audience, internationally, as last years have witnessed various disruptions to our energy system and called for different regulatory reforms. Especially as electricity becomes more important for the entire energy system, with increased electrification of many end-use sectors and threats to energy security evolve and multiply, and as clean energy transition accelerates, including the increasing share of renewable energy and its integration to the grid. At the same time, climate change is causing these extreme events to happen more frequently. Therefore, the main question is how to improve reliability and resiliency of our energy system. Today, we are joined by 4 panelists. They will each have first a 10-minute presentation focusing on different aspects of the Texas power system and the crisis that took place, after which we will have a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. I will provide a brief introduction on our panelists, and then we will move right into the presentations because I believe that 90 minutes that we have reserved today for the webinar will go rather quickly. We are really pleased to have today a really great panel with great amount of experience. I am pleased to introduce Andrea Morstauer, partner at Baker Botts, She has extensive experience representing utilities and other regulated entities on a wide variety of matters. Our second speaker today is Seabron Adamson, Vice President at Charles Rivers Associates. He leads the Global Energy Disputes and Regulatory segment at CRA. He has significant experience in energy-related disputes, covering a wide range of sectors, including electric power, renewable energy, natural gas, and LNG, as well as oil and refined products, pipelines, storage, and distribution. Our third speaker today is Chahal, Managing Director at Berkeley Research Group. He has experience within wholesale power markets, including asset valuation, market structures, resource adequacy planning, transmission development, and high penetration renewable integration. Our fourth speaker today is Branko Terzic. He is the Managing Director at Berkeley Research Group and a former commissioner of the US Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and State of Wisconsin Public Service Commission. So as you can hear, each of our panelists bring many years of experience to the discussion from a variety of different perspectives. Before we begin, I would like to note to the audience that you can submit questions to the Zoom chat throughout the presentations. And these questions will be then presented to the panelists after the presentations of each of the panelists. But we will, however, monitor the submitted questions throughout the presentations to ensure that all of them are duly noted and then within the time limits also presented to our panelists. With that, I would like to jump into the discussions. Andrea, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sirja-Leena. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the legal and regulatory framework in Urcot in particular. There's some differences in the parts of the state that are outside of Urcot, but given that most of the events that the state and the country are focused on occurred in Urcot, we'll focus on that. So the Texas legislature granted the Public Utility Commission broad authority over the operations of Urcot and many of the market participants that are in Urcot. And in particular, in the Utilities Code, the Public Utility Regulatory Act, or PURA, is, as you'll hear it referred to, the legislature established that the commission can adopt and enforce rules relating to the reliability of the grid and account for the production and delivery of electricity. So it can do that itself, but it also can delegate that authority to an independent organization, in this case, Urcot. Urcot then itself, with that delegation, has the ability to adopt rules, protocols, and operating guides as well. So the commission has some of their own rules that relate to reliability and market operations, but given the subject matter expertise that resides at Urcot, a lot of that has been delegated to Urcot. That delegation, though, does not mean that the commission doesn't have oversight. It continues to have oversight, and I think there's been references to the provisions in PURA that say that the PUC has absolute control over Urcot, their budget, governance, and operations. And so to the extent that there are any questions or challenges to the actions that Urcot takes, there's an ability to go to the Public Utility Commission and have that reviewed. But the Public Utility Commission also has authority over many of the market participants in Urcot. Obviously, it ranges in the extent of that jurisdiction. The transmission and distribution utilities and transmission service providers are heavily regulated entities. They're similar to the traditional utilities, vertically integrated utilities. They're rate regulated. Many of their operations are regulated. And so that's at one end. The retail electric providers are sort of in the middle. They are regulated. The commission ensures that they are financially and technically able to provide the services that they're offering in the market. There's consumer protection rules that are applied and that the reps must follow, but they are not rate regulated like the utilities are. And then at the other end is the wholesale generators. They are at the lightest end of regulation in the system. The commission has oversight to the extent that there are wholesale market power issues, abuse of market power issues, but also to the extent that there's reliability questions in operations at Urcot. They have jurisdiction over that as well. There are other entities in the market that the commission has varying sort of levels of jurisdiction over, but it tends to be on the lighter end. Municipal utilities have maintained original jurisdiction over most of their operations, so the commission has very little oversight over municipal utilities. And electric co-ops have some of their activities regulated by the commission, but not retail charges. Those are the co-ops themselves have authority to decide those issues. So that sort of sets the framework. And then one other piece of this puzzle, we'll talk about later, is the independent market monitor, or the IMM, who has been delegated the authority by Urcot and the commission. They engaged the IMM, who monitors the market for market power issues in particular, but also just to determine whether or not the market's functioning as it should, and make recommendations to the extent that the market is not functioning, how it might be resolved. There's no obligation for Urcot or the PUC to adopt any recommendations that the IMM makes. It's information for the PUC to use as it determines how to exercise its jurisdiction. That's the electricity markets. But this event saw a lot of impact on the gas side of the equation. Most of the fleet in Urcot is powered by natural gas. And the oil and gas operations in Texas are overseen by the Railroad Commission of Texas. It's a separate agency, has jurisdiction over those operations, over pipelines, over gas utilities. And the Railroad Commission has extensive authority to oversee safety issues and some environmental issues, and some on more market type issues. But its authority is less sort of expansive than the PUC's is on the electric side. So that sort of sets the stage in terms of the legal and regulatory framework that we're working in Urcot. And I thought it might be helpful because there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that Texas experienced a pretty significant storm in 2011 and what was done after 2011 to prepare for the next time we had a storm. And so we'll talk a little bit about what happened in 2011 and what the state did in response, but then compare that to what we experienced this year, just a couple of weeks ago. It was like ages ago now, but in 2011, we had a significant storm that blew into Texas and hit a lot of the state, and particularly actually the southern part of the state, pretty hard, but it lasted for about 4 days, from February 1st to the 4th. And to sort of take a representative example of the severity of the storm, I've looked at the temperatures that and the precipitation that we experienced here in Austin, which is where I am. The temps range from about 18 degrees as a low to 41 degrees as a high. There were 2 days in Austin where we did not get above freezing, which is unusual for Austin. It's a pretty mild climate here, except for in August when it's extremely hot. And we had a dusting of snow that melted pretty quickly, which, it was unusual in the duration of the temperatures and the fact that we got snow, because we don't normally get snow at all. But it was, I think as a lot of folks would see it as mild in comparison to what we experienced this year. But there was significant icing across the state. We did see rolling outages that year. We had, just to sort of give you some of the statistics in terms of the impact to the grid, the maximum generation capacity forced out in 2011 was just under 15,000 megawatts. We had a little under 200 generators outaged during the event. Urcot directed about 4,000 megawatts of load shed, and the duration of the load shed requested was about 7.5 hours. It was significant. There was significant damage, and citizens, were definitely in danger. It was a big issue in the legislature that year, and the legislature directed the commission to review emergency operating plans for the utilities and the generators, and come up with a plan to ensure that the system is weatherized appropriately. So in the instance that we have another weather event, a winter storm, we're prepared. And the commission did that. It looked at the weatherization plans of generators, and to the extent they didn't have enough information about what generators were doing, they asked for more information. Urcot began a robust sort of spot checking a couple times a year of generators' weatherization plans and whether or not they were being implemented. There were directives for utilities to ensure that natural gas was treated as critical infrastructure, and so that electricity wouldn't be shut off to those facilities. And although there wasn't significant changes to the law or the rules, I think by some folks' assessment, it was taken seriously, and I think people did think that the changes that were made should have helped in the next storm event. The storm that we experienced this year was quite a bit different than 2011. So again, just as a comparison to what we experienced in Austin in 2011 versus 2021, I think I mentioned that we had 2 days in 2011 where we didn't have temperatures above freezing. This year, I think Sirja-Leena mentioned, we're talking about the storm as it occurred from February 14th to around February 18th or 19th. But actually in Austin and a lot of the state, freezing temperatures started on February 11th. And in Austin, we dropped below freezing on the 11th, and we did not have any material increase in temperatures above freezing until February 19th. So we had over a week of freezing temperatures in Austin. So, more than 3 times as long as what we experienced in 2011. And this year, we had a low in the single digits, a low of 8 or 9 degrees, which was significantly colder than what we experienced in 2011. And on February 15th, we received almost 7 inches of snow in Austin. And because of the length of time that we've been experiencing freezing temperatures here, that snow did not melt for over 5 days, which was extraordinary. We've never seen anything like that in this town. And I've lived here off and on for over 25 years. My parents have been here for 50 years. They've never seen anything like it. And again, the impact of the storm varied across the state. It was not all the same, but it was significant. And in terms of impacts to the grid, we saw generation outages of over 50,000 megawatts as compared to 15 in 2011. Over 350 generators outage during the event, which is 150 more than we saw in 2011. Urcot directed load shed of 20,000 megawatts, and the duration of that load shed was more than 70 hours. So while it's certainly hopeful that we would learn lessons from 2011. And I think that a lot of the state did. What we experienced this year was significantly different than I think what we saw in 2011. And I think my time is up, so I will turn it over to the next speaker. But hopefully you can talk a little bit more about some of the fallout in terms of the orders from the commission and proposed legislation.
Okay, well, I think I'm next. Thank you very much, Andrea. Thanks for the invitation from Tulane. I used to teach at Tulane in the business school part-time in the energy program, so and have very fond memories of my time on the Tulane campus. I really want to kind of focus on the kind of economic basis of thinking about changes in policy. Andrea, kind of gave a brief rundown of kind of what happened and the severity of what happened, and certainly there's a lot of things we don't know yet, so we kind of need to remain a little bit open-minded, but we do have some sense of what happened, and she kind of gave a nice overview of that. I really kind of want to think about the kind of economic framework for new policy, kind of looking forward. Towards that, I will caution that I'm speaking for myself, not CRA or its clients, the kind of usual disclosure. I will also offer the warning that I am by nature an economist, and so everything you hear probably kind of starts from an economic perspective, certainly rather than a legal one. But I have been kind of involved in energy markets, electricity markets for a long time, including the very early days of the kind of Urcot market. And you just kind of want to talk about the kind of economic framework for thinking about changes in policy as needed in terms of, meeting as Kim pointed out, making sure this doesn't happen again, or certainly not with the same severity. It was certainly a very severe event, as Andrea pointed out. The conditions were very severe. However, and there are many places in the world where we have temperatures like this frequently. Something like this is, in North Dakota, that's just a Tuesday in the winter. Of course, that there's days, weeks without getting above freezing. So it is possible to make electricity systems work in these conditions. The question is how do we make it happen economically? The first thing I kind of want to point to is, a standard economic one, which is that we really have two mechanisms. We have incentives for behavior and regulations for behavior. And all of these electricity markets rely to some degree on both. The Texas market, probably more than most, as I know Veer's going to talk about, I think right after me, relied more on kind of incentive type mechanisms in terms of investments in capacity, for example. Texas did not have a capacity market, unusually for the US markets, although similar to one or two other places around the world. But, Texas did rely on basically having market clearing with the potential for quite high peak prices to drive incentives to have generation available and incentives for investment. On the other hand, kind of swinging and these things kind of tend to have a pendulum effect a little bit in many parts of the world, is, a more regulatory approach of thou shalt do X and there's penalties if you don't do that. And there's no real kind of perfect balance, but it's quite hard to get these things right. But there is kind of a trade-off or switching between the ideas of having pure market-based incentives for making complex things like power systems work versus more kind of direct regulatory kind of command and control mechanisms. And I don't think anyone exactly has kind of gotten it perfectly right yet. But where you kind of unfortunately have the chance of learning is when things go wrong. So what kind of can potentially go wrong? And like I said, there's a lot we don't know yet, which is, first off, I'd kind of point to a few kind of potential things. One of which on the investment side, investors were looking in the Texas market for at relatively small numbers of high-priced hours that were going to create substantial margins to justify a large capital investment. That's fine. I mean, that works in is a kind of an economic theory thing. It can be very difficult to work in practice. You're kind of guessing how many of those hours they're going to be in the future to support an investment case. And one question, to think about in Texas and in other energy-only markets around the world is, how effective is that mechanism? Does it meet the policy objectives that policymakers have? Can we make that mechanism more efficient if we don't think it's working well enough? Because we are very dependent on predicting, making investments based on expectations of something which is actually quite hard to know, not just the weather, but what everyone else is going to be doing and what that has for kind of future market prices. And that was kind of really towards kind of the heart in some ways of these markets. And the question is if you start changing them, is making sure that we're kind of getting them better. I know Veer's going to talk more about kind of detailed market mechanisms, so I will not steal his thunder. But I think that's one of the things that Texas will probably be looking at in the future. The other point that strikes me very much around the question of reliability, which Andrea also arose, which is the question of the gas sector. One really difficult thing in understanding reliability of electricity systems is where you have the concept of what's called a common mode failure. I'm not an electrical transmission planning engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but I've kind of sat through a bunch of meetings with some of these people over the years. And one of the things that they sometimes would talk about is, worrying about things that aren't independent. So when we have electricity generation, one of the things that makes the statistics work is that when if my generator is out, and if that event is independent statistically of when Veer's is out and Kim's is out and Andrea's is out, the chances that lots of them being out all at the same time is very, very low. And of course, this winter event, both directly with the potential failure of units, if they failed because of temperature or because of gas supply, really kind of highlighted those types of risks. And it's quite hard to develop market mechanisms to deal with those types of risks. I normally live in New England and Boston, and in New England, we're pretty concerned, in fact, with electric reliability with regard to gas, because we also have a lot of gas-fired generation in New England, and we have a relatively small number of major pipelines feeding the region. We're kind of at the end of the gas system, so to speak, in the US. And for example, ISO New England in the past has identified that our biggest kind of large-scale electric reliability problem in New England may in fact be gas supply. One tends to think that, in the past, that Texas always has lots of gas, is one of the biggest gas producing states. But in this case, under certain conditions, maybe there wasn't enough gas. And that has, can have a kind of catastrophic effect on reliability. Again, for that kind of concept of the kind of common mode failure, where events are no longer independent and it seems like large amounts of generation was not available at the same time. One thing that has made these things quite difficult to deal with in the US, and this is not just in Texas, is the fact, as Andrea also pointed out, that gas and power systems also tend to have different forms of regulation, often different regulatory agencies, and even where they don't, they have different market structures. So, even outside of Texas, say in most of the country where power markets are subject to FERC regulation, just like and gas markets, operation of gas pipelines is somewhat subject to FERC regulation. The actual regulatory structure is quite different, and how those actual market systems work is very, very different. If I am a gas production company, I'm really not thinking about the same way by my business from a regulatory perspective in the same way that an electric generator is in terms of my regulatory reaction. I may have very, very different views of my incentives to ensure that all of my gas assets are capable of producing gas and not having freeze off of wells under all conditions. That we typically have freeze offs in wells in many parts of the United States to some degree. Sounds like from what has been reported that took on a kind of a much larger scale effect here, and that we also had failures in gas infrastructure from what was reported further on down the gas supply chain all the way to the electric generation side. So in terms of again, before I kind of summing things up here, when we think about redesigning our kind of market structures, and I'll hand off to Vera on that in a second, we need to think about what actually provides the incentives or the regulations which really, really actually drive reliability as important. Of course, there's sufficient generation investment, but there's also sufficient gas supply investment, particularly, and in a very complicated fashion, ensuring that the market rules actually drive the behaviors which will increase reliability in the future. I don't think any market's kind of really gotten this perfectly right yet. So there's not one obvious kind of model to choose from outside of Texas or outside of the United States even, but there's clearly kind of a lot to learn as we try to kind of look forward into the kind of policy future to improve things for the next. Now over to you, Vera.
Thanks, Seabron. Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about market design and market structure, particularly in Urcot, but then also how it varies from other places, and then probably just share a few kind of anecdotes that I've kind of read along the way as well. So I do just have a couple of slides that might help frame the conversation that I'll share as well. So essentially there's really broadly speaking, 3 ways in which regions try and meet their kind of reserve margin targets, which is the amount of capacity that they carry above what they think the peak demand hour will be in the forecasted years. And so the first is, as mentioned, through capacity markets, the best examples of which really exist in the Northeast and PJM in New York and New England. MISO technically has one as well, though it's not very highly participated in at this point in time. But these markets essentially pay resources to simply be available during expected times of high demand. So they're forward-looking markets. They typically clear a single price for a year or a season. And this essentially it gives market signals, and it gives some sort of financial signals as well to allow resources to be built several years in advance of when they may be needed. So this will be in addition to typical energy payments that you receive to actually provide that energy, as you would in every market else of the energy market. So as you would expect, each resource also can bid in a certain amount of their capacity into these markets. So thermal resources will have a high capacity value that may be very close to their total capability. And it's all dependent upon how available they'll be at any hour given the year, with forced outages taken into consideration. Renewable resources, generally tend to have a lower capacity value, particularly wind more so than solar, since solar tends to be online during on-peak hours as they're intermittent resources. And so they may not be available during the highest demand hours of the year. So for example, if you're a wind plant in Ohio, you may only be allowed to bid in 12% of your total capacity into the capacity market, because that's what historically wind plants have provided during those peak hours of the year. So in this way, you kind of are able to count up the amount of total expected available capacity at the specific times of the year that you think that you would need it. And that's, broadly functioning how a capacity market would work. Then there's the second through, what's generally broadly deemed resource adequacy, which is, it's done in varying forms, but it's really how the non-deregulated markets, approach the issue. And in this instance, utilities will do internal planning, they'll do reliability planning, they'll create capacity expansion plans as part of a integrated resource plan that they need to submit, and then they have to gain approval from state regulators. So this is, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum in that it's a non-market driven approach to the same issue. And then finally, there's Urcot, which, at least for the North American markets is fairly unique, in which there's an energy only market. So all of their ability to incentivize resource adequacy is embedded into the energy market. So kind of on this chart, you can see that the way that this works is that as the available reserves on the system, so essentially this is the amount of generation that the system has, however, is not currently already committed to deploy. And so as that decreases, then they start adding a scarcity price adder. So that price adder is zero as it's above 4,500 or 5,000 megawatts available on the system, and then starts to increase somewhat slowly and then more quickly as it hits the price cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour, which Urcot has determined to be the value that they believe is equivalent to the value of lost load. So if they needed to shed load on the system, as happened last month, the value of shed load is essentially $9,000 per megawatt hour, and that's a price cap that we sat at for several days. So the idea of having this operating reserve demand curve or a DC is really to incentivize more resources to come online. In this particular instance, there really were no more resources that could come online. So we sat at that $9,000 per megawatt hour for several days as an incentive structure, but it wasn't working because everything that was available was already being dispatched. And there was no ability for new resources to come online, whether due to lack of gas or coal piles freezing or wind turbines freezing or whatever the case may have been. So the incentive structure here, to some degree, while it was designed and was working as intended, did fail to kind of produce the result that it was more or less made to produce. So, one of the interesting point of that is that, as Seabron had mentioned, this is how a lot of new development comes on, is that they expect there might be 20 hours out of the year at $9,000 per megawatt hour. And there might be 50 hours out of the year where you get a $200 price adder that's also helping to incentivize new builds, and it has to do with kind of the capacity to demand balance that's on the system. And Urcot did think about what would happen if we had scarcity pricing one year that was just much higher than we really needed to incentivize new capacity. And so they have a essentially rule in place, the PUC does, where they would move that price from $9,000 to $2,000, and the scarcity pricing cap would be lower because they've determined that, well, now we're just paying generators. They've already made more than enough money to incentivize new generation. We don't need to be more or less paying them additional at the expense of the ratepayers. However, the caveat in that rule is that it's either $2,000 or 50 times the natural gas price cap. And since the natural gas price cap, or since natural gas prices were so high, they deemed that the price should stay at $9,000 per megawatt hour. And so, you know, it was kind of just obviously an unforeseen circumstance. And so that's how you ended up getting prices to stay at this level for such an extended amount of time. So if we think about, you know, how does that type of market structure impact the development within a region? Here you have just about 10 years of reserve margin levels in Urcot and in MISO. And so, you know, the first thing you'll see is that Urcot is generally just much lower. So as Andrea mentioned earlier, there was 2011 where you had particularly high prices driven a lot by the winter event in 2011. And after that 2011 event, you know, kind of look forward 2 to 3 years and you see that there's quite a bit of development that occurs because people are chasing some of that scarcity pricing that they expect to occur based on those events. And Urcot also releases demand forecasts, and you know, those demand forecasts at the time showed that it would be likely that there'd be a significant amount of scarcity pricing events occurring over the next few years. That didn't really materialize, and prices stayed relatively low for several years after that time frame, until you see in like 2016, 2017 that a lot of retirements started occurring, and it's due to sustained low pricing. And so there's no guaranteed payments for capacity, and if there's low pricing and you're unable to clear the market at any kind of regularity, or you're clearing and your margins are much lower, then you know, this is when you may choose to retire. And so you see really a slew of retirements. Several of them were coal retirements, but really across the board, a lot of retirements occurring between 2016 and 2018, really up to 2019. At that time frame, really most of the additional resources that were coming online were through wind resources, which, you know, as I mentioned earlier, aren't exactly high capacity value resources. And so now over the last 3 years, you've had reserve margins that are at or below 10%. And so that kind of, you know, puts you in a situation where you're much below any other region within the US and really most deregulated markets in general, which, you know, as you get to 15% or somewhere between 15 and 20%, typically the incentives start to be very large where you're going to get new development to come online. And you saw it last year, and you obviously have seen, or at least in 2019, and you're seeing it again in this year in a, you know, extremely broad way, but you're starting to see more investment come online again. A lot of that is again still with renewables and solar and wind, but you're also starting to see some new gas, and quite a bit of utility scale storage is now starting to think about entering the system. And so that's kind of how the investment cycles in Urcot are designed to work. It's just that the combination of a winter event like we just saw with the fact that you had particularly low reserve margins is obviously a bad look. You know, quite a few other things went wrong, so it may not have mattered if they had considerable more generation, but it certainly couldn't have hurt in that particular instance. So a couple other things, you know, in regards to, you know, I guess political or policy decisions that Urcot has made is, you know, I think it's been well documented now that Urcot is neither part of the Eastern Interconnect or the Western Interconnect, which are essentially allows broad power sharing through the AC network that makes up the vast majority of, you know, all the transmission links in North America. So Urcot does have a few DC connections with its neighbors, but otherwise it's really is islanded. And so, you know, this was done specifically to make it so that because Urcot's interconnection did not cross state lines, that it wouldn't be subject to all of the same rules that other areas are from FERC. And so they just essentially didn't want government intervention, federal government intervention, and I guess people like Branko to be meddling in the way that they kind of do business within their state. So, would that have helped in this particular instance? Probably to some degree, but again, because this was such a widespread event, the regions in which they neighbor with were also under significant, emergency procedures. So there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is that, MISO was importing up to 10 gigawatts during this event, and that's points kind of east of Texas and then goes up into the Midwest. And then SPP, straight north of Texas, was importing about 5 to 6 gigawatts during this event. So they may or may not have been able to help Urcot very much, but the fact that they were connected to other portions of the Eastern Interconnect certainly helped them to mitigate some of the worst that could have happened on their systems. So, when we're thinking about this, obviously there's the lack of gas, the market structure within Urcot, the fact that they're not connected. I don't think that solving any one issue would have solved this particular instance of events, but I think all of them need to be looked at together to try and consider how to prevent this type of market failure going forward. So I think the only other point that I did want to make, and I know that people have already kind of mentioned a little bit of this in the comments, is around weatherization. And as Andrea had mentioned, Urcot did start doing spot testing for power plants to see if they are weatherized and to what degree. There's not a formal process for how that occurs at this time, and so really they had an unclear view of which plants were appropriately weatherized and which ones were not. It was a combination of, they hadn't done enough spot checking in recent years, plus over the last year, all of it had been done virtually due to COVID. And so I know at this point in time that they are considering, a new bill in Texas to both formalize that process and require plants to be weatherized, as they are in many other parts of this country. And so, that is another, key element that's part of all of this that certainly is being looked at and will need to be kind of determine what the best course of action is, as it seemed that they had started going in the right direction after 2011, but never quite got to where they needed to be. Yeah, with that, I'm gonna hand this off to Branko, and yeah, during the Q&A portion of this.
Very good. Let's move the slide off the screen there. And thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think one of the issues that comes up here is the fact that one of the victims of this tragedy is going to be trust in regulation. If we're already talking about trust in regulation, we've lost that trust. And that came out, unfortunately, during the public hearings before the Texas Senate and the Texas legislature, where the chairman of the then chairman of the commission apparently was unsure of her authority, unsure of her relationship with Urcot, unsure of even whether she could be removed by the governor. This all, I think, added to the lack of trust in the system. So we have three major issues now confronting the governor of Texas, the Texas legislature, and who will ever be the Texas Public Utility Commission of Texas, which is now down to one individual. So it's a three-person commission. There's only one individual there. Nonetheless, that individual has the full authority of the commission. There are three areas that need to be worked on: the area of governance, the area of regulation, and the area of market structure. And let's take each one of those. Separately. With respect to governance, the legislature and the governor are going to have to figure out what to do with Urcot, what the future Urcot will look like, what it'll be named, what will be the composition of Urcot. Urcot was made up of specific individuals from specific sectors of the economy, also some national experts from outside the state of Texas. There is already legislation requiring that all of the members of the future Urcot be Texas residents. The size of Urcot will be discussed. There is discussion about whether consumer advocates ought to be on the Urcot board. So that's going to be up to the legislature to look at. Legislature was also take a look at the relationship between Urcot and the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Is there enough authority? Is it clear? Why wasn't it clear to the chairman of the Texas Public Utility Commission that she was in charge of Urcot? And notions that certain things couldn't be done, weatherization, because there was not direct authority to weatherize non-regulated power plants. Even one of the state senators said, well, couldn't you use conditioning authority? And that is, look, we regulate Urcot, the market. You can't participate in the market unless you meet certain conditions. One of the conditions could be you have to be weatherized. Now, we're not regulating you. We're just saying, and I'm saying this as the former chairman of a racing commission where we regulated gambling. If you want to play in the market, you've got to apply, you've got to conform to the rules, and the rule is you have to be weatherized. So the governance is there. The legislature is going to take a look at this. They're going to have to decide what Urcot's going to look like and what the relationship between the future Urcot and the commission. With respect to regulation, there are going to be issues about what failed at the Public Utility Commission of Texas. Was it the quality of the appointees? Was it the number of the appointees? Was it the rule? The chairman said she couldn't talk to the other members of the commission one-on-one because of open meeting rules, and yet it was pointed out later that there were emergency provisions where the commissioners could talk to each other. There's a 3-person commission. There's going to be discussion whether it ought to go to 5 people. The authority over Urcot, as I mentioned before, would be viewed. The Texas Railroad Commission will also have to be reviewed in this because it's clear that there were problems getting gas from Texas wells to Texas power plants. And there was a circular finger pointing. The electric generator said we couldn't get the gas and therefore we couldn't produce electricity. The chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission said, well, we've switched over to electric compressor stations and our electric compressors couldn't get the electricity, so we couldn't deliver the gas. And then there was a discussion about why aren't electric compressors on a higher priority. And so that's going to have to be worked through with quite a bit of insight. The other area, of course, is market structure. It was mentioned by my 2 colleagues. Are they going to continue ahead with the energy-only structure? They're going to look at capacity markets. Texas has looked at capacity markets before a number of times. Texas has looked at their reserve margin before a number of times. In a 2014 report, the consultant pointed out that you could have higher reserve, but it will cost you more. But even there, the consultant pointed out that the current reserve margins, the economic reserve margin at 9%, 1 and 10 year would be about 13%. Texas Commission says it does not establish a mandatory reserve margin, but built into the economics of its energy market, it believes the target should be about 10% reserve. Nationally, we're at 15%. Keep in mind, in this country in the 1980s, the national reserve margins were 30 to 35%. We know from history, and I'm speaking as an engineer that's looked at economics, that it's cheaper to have extra reserve than it is to have outages. And even a 2014 report commissioned by the Texas Commission pointed out that going from a reserve margin 11.5% to 14% would only cost about $100 million a year. Compare that to the billions, 30, 40, 50 billion that has been lost in this market. And you'll see that increasing reserve margins is clearly going to be something they're going to have to do from common sense, from pressure from the regulators, from their own reanalysis of the cost of outages versus the cost to the reserve. The market structure, the legislature is already looking at laws to change the retail market structure. For example, there is legislation to forbid having prices tied to wholesale prices. Is that a good policy or not? Those were the people that bought those, which was only like in the 20 to 30,000 out of millions of customers in Texas, a very small portion purchased those policies because at the time it seemed to be cheaper than a fixed cost contract. The most typical kind of contract in Texas is the consumers don't want to have time of day rates. They don't want to have seasonal rates. They don't even want to have annual rates. They want a multi-year fixed price contract. And so most of Texas residential consumers were protected against, in the competitive market, were protected against the price spikes because they had signed up for retail fixed prices, meaning that their wholesale suppliers had to eat the cost of the large market. It wasn't the case with the cooperatives and others, where they were buying in the wholesale market and having to turn around and sell at fixed prices. So we've got issues there with respect to a huge hit taken by quite a few of the municipals and the cooperatives that are out there. Texas will look at maybe an integrated resource plan. They'll look at a capacity market. They'll look at their mix of technologies. Right now, Texas is heavily dependent on 53% of their generation is on natural gas. Half of the outages were based on gas shortage, not on freeze-offs. So Texas will have to look at those two together and make some decisions. My analysis is that in the near term, here's what's got to happen. Number one, the current commission, Public Utility Commission with the one commissioner, is going to have to decide what to do with the independent market monitor's recommendation to roll back prices by 1/3 for the cost incurred. They're already Lieutenant Governor and others are pressing. There was not a vote of the commission. The two commissioners that were there merely expressed their preference, but the commission has the opportunity to revisit that on a 30-day window. Secondly, the governor is going to have to appoint, and the state senate is going to have to review the qualifications of 2 new commissioners, given the law the way it is, and that'll be controversial. What kind of person do you want? What kind of background, etc. Fourth, there will have to be appointments to the Urcot board. The way unless Urcot laws change, they've lost quite a number of their board members. They have lost their CEO. There'll have to be a new CEO appointed. That will be controversial. There'll have to be decisions there. There, of course, and then of course there is the question of what new legislation would come out from the legislature. The new commission is going to have to initiate investigations. There's going to have to be an open docket on what happened, how it happened. A record has to develop a factual record upon which decisions can be made. And then finally, we've also got the issue, is the state going to do anything with respect to state assistance to the municipal, cooperative, and individual customers that were hit with unconscionably high bills? The trust in the system has to be reinstated, and that's going to have to be done with the combination of the governor, the legislature, and the Public Utility Commission. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for all of our panelists. So we will move right into the Q&A session. And I have a question first coming from the audience. Was anything that happened in the systemic failure actually illegal?
It's not, this is Branko, it's not clear. independent market monitor is there to look to see whether there was market manipulation. That is the fundamental role of the market monitor. And so far, the monitor has not indicated that there was manipulation. And so there may be other illegal acts, but clearly the big one would be based on the California experience of 2000, where there were forced to disgorge profits by the FDRC. At this point, it doesn't appear that there's been any finding of market manipulation. Withholding of gas, that's another thing. Once again, we'll have to have an investigation.
Yeah, this is Andrea. So far, as Branko was saying, the IMM hasn't seen any evidence of market manipulation or withholding of power. The gas issue is another question. You know, there's an investigation open at the commission now. There's a lot of investigations. Urcot's sending requests for information to generators and other market participants. The PUC is open an investigation. The legislature is conducting their own investigation. So I think, and I actually as well at FERC and NERC, I think they're investigating. So to the extent that there was any, violations of the law, I think that'll come out. It's just a matter of time.
Thank you. I would like to discuss a little bit about the winterization or weatherization. That was also one of the first initial responses to the crisis, that there is lack of winterization in Texas. And I know that Andrea and you mentioned a little bit about what was happening and what developments took place after the 2011 crisis in respect of this. The obligations that were being introduced in the post-2011, these were not actually mandatory obligations to the parties. Am I correct in this? And could you also perhaps briefly describe what does this kind of winterization mean in practice? What does it mean and entail?
Yeah, so to be clear, that there is a requirement that that power generators and the transmission and distribution utilities have emergency operation plans, and they must have those plans on file at the Public Utility Commission and at Urcot. So there is a requirement there to have the plans, and then I think as both Veer and I spoke about, Urcot is tasked with checking to see if those plans are being followed. I think there has been some question about the extent to which the commission and or Urcot has the ability to take any action to the extent that the plans are not being followed. And that's what a lot of the debate is happening about now in terms of additional legislation to potentially put some teeth into the idea of what, if there are generators or utilities who aren't following their plan and properly weatherizing. I think the other issue, as Branko pointed out, a lot of this is also, the generators were certainly having issues with freezing conditions at their units, and to be frank, weather conditions they've never seen before. So there's a question of whether or not the weatherization that they had done in light of 2011 and other weather events that had happened in Texas before was, enough of a precursor for them to plan for the kind of things they were seeing this year. But the other issue is there's so much of the generation fleet that was out because of gas supply issues. And so that's a different question in terms of, my understanding at one point, the Permian was down in production to about half what they typically had seen in the past. And because of freezing at the wellhead, oil and gas production requires a lot of water. Water was freezing. Roads were not passable, so operators were not able to get teams out to bring those wells back online and deal with the freezing conditions. We're just, most of the state is not set up to, salt roads and plow snow, because we just don't see it that often. So, you know, what we need to do in the future, you know, considering that it's likely we'll see some weather events like this, you know, maybe not every 10 years, but definitely, again, you know, how do we plan and prepare for that, not just on the generation side, but on the oil and gas side and the, you know, the fuel infrastructure side. So we have to look at it all together.
There's another weatherization issue as well, and that is if you're going to weatherize for minus 10 degrees below zero, equipment which has to operate in 105-degree Texas summer, you run the risk of reducing capacity and creating problems there. So it is more complicated than just well, let's just weatherize it for this extremely cold weather. There are consequences, and so it's a more complicated issue than it might first appear.
Thank you, Branko. That's a very interesting point. We also have more specific questions relating to the weatherization. Should electric generators who rely on natural gas be required to purchase natural gas only from producers who have weatherized their equipment? Any views on that?
I think it's an interesting question. You know, I mean, I'm certain that the legislature and the Railroad Commission and the PUC are all looking at ways to ensure that generators have, you know, access to gas. You know, one of the issues in Texas is that most of the natural gas generators don't have firm contracts and don't store gas, because they've never experienced an instance in which they've had such limited availability to gas and or seen prices like we saw that week. So, you know, and in order for them to, you know, have storage and firm contracts, that's going to cost, you know, considerably more money than they've spent in the past. So all of this is going to be, you know, a balancing act, which, you know, is always present in energy markets like this. But that I think, you know, since we experienced such an extreme event, it's brought it even sort of more to the forefront is how much are we willing to pay to avoid, you know, instances in which we're not able to operate, you know, be it every 10 years, 20 years, whatever the case may be. So, you know, I think the generators just hadn't anticipated the kind of limited availability to gas supply. And that'll be a question going forward, is how we deal with it.
Yeah, just sorry, go ahead, Seabron.
And remember, there's network reliability effects on gas as well as power. You know, I contract with Andrea, and she owns a gas field, and she says she's producing gas, and I say, oh, I want to buy gas at my power plant. The methane she's putting into the system at one end is not the same gas I'm taking out. I mean, the gas is all fungible in a network, right? And I am producing gas from you kind of nominally in contractual terms, but I mean, the gas is all flowing through the same systems. And there is a kind of a network effect of that. If, you know, everybody on the gas, if there's not sufficient supply, the fact that my supplier for my relatively small amount for the level of consumption on the gas system, that does not, me signing a contract that says even if your gas operates perfectly may not mean that I actually get gas, right? I may have firm transportation rights on certain pipeline infrastructure, but there is also kind of network effects of having sufficient gas supply to make everything work. And that's going to be kind of, as I pointed out, I think that's going to be kind of that's kind of a hard thing to crack, right? We've in general not required historically, to my knowledge at least, a lot of reliability rules on individual gas wells production, right? You know, they got to decide what they wanted to do, right? And they put gas in and they can sell it. Now, having weatherization rules tens or hundreds of thousands of individual gas wells across the United States is very different than having weatherization rules around, a relatively small number of gas-fired power plants.
How about in relation to actually what was already being mentioned, do you see that Texas should invest in more gas storage facilities in order to compensate for wellhead production interruptions? So would that be an alternative or another option in addition to the winterization?
That's going to be a pure economics question. Is it even economic to have, I guess they're talking about storage at the power plant, or what we call market area storage. It would seem to me, unless you're located just accidentally on top of a vacant field, and you don't have to build an LNG facility, or you don't have to build a major storage facility, it might be economic, but I can't imagine it would be otherwise or necessary, given other things that could probably be done cheaper with respect to the network.
And remember, with gas, it's not how much gas there is in storage, how much gas there is in the system. A lot of it is about deliverability of gas. How fast can I take gas out of storage and out of fields when the temperatures really plummet, right? So I could have a lot of storage. I might have had a ton of gas in depleted field storage, for example, say in Texas, in theory. I mean, this is purely hypothetical, but most of that storage is not designed for high deliverability rate. And so can I withdraw it fast enough to meet my demand on a super peak day? There's salt dome storage that allows very high deliverability rates, but that's usually limited to very specific locations and very specific quantities. So it's not that there's not a lot of gas in general. Sometimes it's how fast can you get it out, even if you have it.
We have one more question in relation to the winterization. How much of the interruptions were due to the actual power plants failing because of lack of winterization, and how much was loss of natural gas supply due to freezing upstream? Do you have any information on that?
I saw one figure which said 1/2 of the electricity outages were due to gas shortage. So that would imply the other half were other reasons, including power plant problems. And of course, we do have some nuclear plants. One nuclear plant that went out wouldn't have anything to do with natural gas.
Yeah, and I think there were a variety. I wouldn't say necessarily the rest were all specifically, freezing conditions at the plant. I know there were generators who weren't able to be online for a while because the water main in the city broke, and they were not able to get, they need steam for the plants to run, and they were not able to get water for a while. There were also, because of the instability of the grid, and there's still some investigation going on about this, but the grid is meant to be maintained at a stable frequency in order to operate optimally, and when it dips down, it can have consequences in terms of tripping generators offline. And this is all still being looked at, but there's some indication that when the grid dipped down to, I think it was 59.3 megahertz, and then it actually jumped up again, that caused some generators to trip offline as well. And some generators were having a hard time getting back online after that. So, one thing that I did want to mention is that there's a lot of activity being undertaken both at the legislature and the commission, and investigations are ongoing, and lots of bills being proposed. And obviously, it's a good idea to make some changes to try and help prevent something so severe happening again. But I guess, just from a personal perspective, I hope that there's some willingness to slow down a little bit and see what comes of some of these investigations before we take drastic steps, because I think it'll be important to really understand where the root causes of a lot of these issues were. And it's not it's not apparent to me that we have that full picture yet. I think there needs to be some more time for folks to dig in and see what happened.
Thank you. Then a bit of a different theme. What legal remedies are available to the consumers and business and consumers against Aircod and the Public Utilities Commission and the state of Texas resulting from the disruptions?
Well, I think it's a bit of a difficult legal question. You know, I mean, the state of Texas and the Public Utility Commission is an arm of the state of Texas. You know, they have sovereign immunity. There's certainly legal avenues to challenge orders that were issued potentially. You know, we haven't seen anything specifically yet. Most of what we've seen were lawsuits filed against either the transmission and distribution utilities, the power generators, and then also Urcot has been added to a lot of those. Currently, Urcot has taken the position that they also have sovereign immunity. There's a case currently pending in front of the Texas Supreme Court in which Urcot has sought to dismiss a case that was brought against it by a generator from a few years ago. So the Texas Supreme Court is considering now whether or not Urcot does have sovereign immunity and therefore, you know, wouldn't have liability. But it's it's a difficult question to consider whether or not, you know, what would happen if it's determined that Urcot doesn't have sovereign immunity, and you know what the implications might be in terms of, you know, operating the grid and the market, but being open to the kind of liability that, you know, folks are claiming it should be. You know, and those are difficult legal questions and policy questions ultimately, to know whether or not that makes the most sense. Urcot is a pass through in terms of on the market side. You know, it has its own authority, but it's delegated by the PUC, as we discussed earlier, and you know it collects money from people purchasing power and passes that on to the folks that are selling it, and it doesn't. It's a nonprofit organization that is an instrumentality of the state. So, you know, assigning liability to Urcot may have some, you know, difficult consequences.
Well, it clearly has no assets,
right.
And whether it has liability insurance is another matter. So I don't think you're going to get much out of them if you do sue them for damages, if you will.
My next question would have been, given the business structure with Aircod and the Texas legislature, does Aircod have any claim of sovereign immunity? You mentioned that already, but do you want to add on that, Andrea? Or
I don't think there's anything else to add at this point. It's, you know, we'll hopefully hear from the Supreme Court soon and know where we stand.
Thank you. Well, then there has been a lot of discussion about Texas being an island. And I know that you discussed a little bit on this. What do you see, what developments could take place in the future with regard to this specific structure of the Texas grid? Do you think this crisis will prompt to any further discussion on interconnections or?
Yeah, this is Branko. I think going back to Veer's statement, would Texas have survived differently if it was connected with its neighbors, all of whom are in the same weather zone that Texas is? And so somebody will investigate that. My gut feeling is they'll decide that Urcot is big. It's bigger than many countries. It's bigger than many island nations. And it can have a competitive market without tying to its neighbors. It can investigate, do the neighbors have excess lower cost power than Texas does? If they don't, then the connection would only be for reserves, at which point you might want to booster the DC lines rather than come under the FERC. So it will be looked at, but Texas is not some small little island. Urcot is a large area, lots of generators, and a lot of market participants, over 115 residential competitors with 300 and some different kinds of products. So it's a vigorous, large market that may not need to be interconnected, but that'll certainly be looked at.
Thank you. So there has been a lot of blaming and shaming in the aftermath of the crisis. We have one question. Do you think Aircod should be given more credit than it's getting because it may have prevented a complete grid collapse?
I do, because I listened to the CEO's testimony before the Senate. He went into detail on how close they were to having the entire system collapse. It's clear to me that the engineers and economists and statisticians working at Urcot were there 24/7. They did an extraordinary job. They probably did save the entire system from collapsing, and on that, I'll give them credit.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of, I guess Urcot has a lot of functions, right? So in regards to their ability to essentially, we were really minutes away from a total blackout of Urcot, and they did quite well in essentially being able to prevent that from occurring. And then Urcot gets a lot of blame because most of what they do is based upon forecasting. And it's, as clear now, it's regressive forecasting. So when you're doing kind of reliability planning, you're often planning for a 1 in 10 year type of event. Obviously, you can plan for a 1 in 100 year event, but the economics start to deteriorate the further you go down that pathway. And I think the issues that have happened in Texas is that the events aren't. We had to shed a little bit of load for an hour. It's that people were without electricity and heat and for several days on end, and that can obviously cause a lot of pain and a lot of issues. And so in regards to our Urcot's forecasting procedures, right, that's one question. But in regards to what they did to mitigate how bad this particular event could have been, I think they certainly deserve credit.
Let me commend to the audience the Electric Power Research Institute report that came out in January this year, in which they indicated that we may have to look at our weather and other assumptions just based on climate change factors, where the tail events, the rare events are more common, and maybe in the future, a once in 100 year event might occur every 10 years. Because of climate change variability. And so I would commend that EPRI report to everybody to take a look at.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we need to start wrapping up the discussion. So many of our audience, they have been asking the question that what needs to be done in order to prevent such crises taking place in the future. So by way of summing up the discussion, could each of you add one issue that you think should be prioritized in order for this kind of crisis to prevent from taking place in the future? So what would you consider as the most important next step?
Well, I'll go first. I'll say they have to make new appointments to the Public Utility Commission, and they're going to need some really fine people there because they have some significant decisions to make almost immediately.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I think long-term we need to, continue the investigations to find out, what the real solutions are, be it weatherization or, the way we direct load shedding. But I think, focusing on the market issues, and particularly right now, some of the issues that are facing market participants, given the huge settlement invoices and collateral calls that are happening, how do we address it now? It's going to take probably action that it's not going to be able to wait for the legislature to take 30 days or 60 days or 90 days to pass laws that needs focus now.
Thank you. Ver?
Yeah, so I actually started my career doing long-term planning at the New York ISO, and so I think what Branko had just touched on is what I would consider is that the way that resource adequacy planning has been done for quite some time probably just needs to be reevaluated, not just in Texas, but across really the world, and particularly in the US, because these types of events were never part of our planning models there. So it's not just in Texas that where you're not looking at what would really happen if we have a larger occurrence of the type of climate events that we're seeing with more and more frequency, and in all likelihood is only going to be exacerbated. And so I would say that I think it's both for Texas and more broadly for the people who are running power markets and are responsible for reliability to take a clear-eyed view of what they should really be considering when it comes to reliability planning.
Thank you. And Seabron?
Well, I certainly would echo lots of the comments made by others, but certainly raise we need to start thinking more broadly, not just in Urcot, about combined gas and electric reliability and how these market and regulatory structures are going to work together, given that the interdependencies are so high and the consequences seem to be very large.
Thank you. Panelists, I want to extend my thanks to you for this important, timely discussion. Today, it was great pleasure having you. Audience, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sending over these great questions to our panelists. And then, of course, I want to also thank you, Kim, and the Tulane events team who helped to put this whole webinar together. Thank you, and hope to see you again soon.